Hi, my name is MJ Convey. If you're new here, I'm a guitarist who makes music education videos on YouTube, and if you're an older viewer, I apologize for my inconsistent upload schedule. You might find this video a bit different from the ones I usually make here, but I don't intend for this to be a change in the topics I cover on this YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about fascism. We're going to talk about what it is, what it does, and how you can spot it. And we're going to do this by looking at a very famous essay from 1995 and applying it to what's happening in the United States right now. Because of this video's subject matter, it's probably going to get demonetized and suppressed by YouTube, so I would appreciate it if everybody liked and shared this video, because hopefully by the end of it you'll see why what we're talking about is so important. Also, disclaimers, many more competent people than me have written a lot of books about this. So apologies in advance if you feel like I forgot to talk about something or could have talked about something a little bit more. I'm going to try and link as much supplemental material as I can in the description of this video, but if you feel like there's a video that I forgot to link, feel free to link it in the comments and I'll try and add it to the description later. So I'm going to set the stage by telling you about a series of revelations I had throughout my childhood. We're going to start in 2008. I'm 9 years old, it's a weekday morning, specifically the time of morning where the school principal makes their announcements over the intercom and then guides the class in the Pledge of Allegiance. For those who didn't grow up in the United States, the Pledge of Allegiance is a little ritual that elementary school kids do every morning before class, where what you do is you turn to the nearest flag, and I think that every classroom has to have a flag for this reason. You put your right hand, and only your right hand, on your chest over your heart, and you recite these words. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now for some of you this is probably already raising some red flags, but for people who grow up in the United States we don't really think about it because it's something that we're told to do every morning starting at age 5. So when I was 9, the US war on terror was still very pervasive in American culture, and it debatably still is. And perhaps as a way of raising morale with the American people, a lot of documentaries were being made about previous conflicts that the US was victorious in. This naturally meant that I was learning a lot about World War II, about the European theater specifically, and the existential threat of the Nazis. I'd seen lots of footage of military parades and soldiers marching in lockstep, but I had also learned a lot about the way that the Nazis used propaganda and how they were determined to indoctrinate the youth of Germany. Knowing all of this, I started to get this weird feeling in my stomach on this day in 2008. I looked to my left and then to my right, and I saw all of my classmates looking up at the flag, reciting in unison words that I knew none of us understood. And even though I couldn't describe it at the time, I couldn't shake this weird feeling that there was something eerily similar between what we were being made to do and what the children of Germany were made to do in the 1930s and 40s. And so at that moment, I decided that my allegiance was something that had to be earned, not given. And I never said the Pledge of Allegiance again prior to making this video. The next major event for me came when I was 11. At the recommendation of a friend, I read the book Milkweed by Jerry Spinelli, a historical fiction novel written from the perspective of a young Jewish boy growing up in the Warsaw Ghetto. By this point, I'd seen a lot of documentaries, so I kinda knew what the Holocaust was, but it was always just this event from a distant past. But reading Milkweed helped me to understand what it was like for the people who lived through those events, to understand what it was like to be forcibly separated from society because of one's faith or ethnic background. Even though it's a book for children, I would say that Milkweed is one of the most important books I've ever read. And now finally, the year is 2014. I'm 15 years old. Michael Brown has just been shot by the police, sparking widespread protest, especially in Ferguson, Missouri, where he was shot. Over the years, I had learned a lot about the different forms of systemic discrimination faced by many people in the U.S. I had been taught about the struggle of African Americans for equality that continues to this day. But in the classroom, it had always been framed in such a way that it just never occurred to me what was really happening. But on that day in 2014, it finally occurred to me that I live in a country where children are subjected to sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms of indoctrination, and where various systems are used to separate people who look different, who are then often treated differently and have many of their rights denied to them by the state. And everything just kind of clicked in my head and I was like, what the fuck?
period of our national history has had its special challenges. Those that confront us now are as momentous as any in the past.
Now I know what you're probably thinking. Really, MJ? A video essay about fascism? How very 2017 of you. At this pace you might make it to 2022 by 2027. But it is 2022 at the time of recording, which means that it's an election year here in the United States, which means that there's going to be a lot of fascists running for office. And I want people to be able to spot those individuals, that way they can make an informed decision when they cast their ballot. Hence, we interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you a video essay about fascism. Now, even though it's 2022 at the time of recording, we're going to need to take a trip back in time to 1995, when a man named Umberto Eco wrote an essay called Fascism, in which he describes what many have adopted as the 14 definitive characteristics of fascism. Now, many people have criticized Eco's writings about fascism, and I also have some criticisms that we will get to. But whenever I watch someone else's video or read someone else's essay about fascism, I always feel like there's a little something missing from their analysis, and I always find myself coming back to Eco's 14 characteristics of fascism. Something that I think sets Eco apart from other scholars of fascism is that while many focus on what fascists do or what they think, I think that Eco's writings can be helpful in understanding how fascists think, which is important if we're thinking about combating fascism because it allows us to anticipate how they might perceive our actions and how they might react. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be presenting Eco's characteristics of fascism in a different order than some people might be used to seeing them, but I will also be putting their original order of appearance in parentheses, and even though I'm presenting them in a specific order for my own reasons, it should be noted that no individual characteristic is more important than the others. In fact, Eco himself states that just a single one of these characteristics can be enough for a fascist movement to develop around. He also states that even if a movement doesn't exhibit all 14 characteristics, it could still conceivably be considered fascist, which is relevant when we're talking about modern fascist movements because they try and make an effort to avoid exhibiting all 14. So without further ado, let's talk about the first characteristic of fascism. Characteristic number 1, the cult of tradition. So I'm going to say this right from the start. If any of this seems confusing or nonsensical, that's because it is. Fascism is an ideology that is absolutely riddled with internal contradictions. It doesn't make sense because it isn't supposed to. This is directly observable in Eco's very first characteristic of fascism, the cult of tradition. I say this because there isn't actually anything sacred about traditions. All traditions that have ever existed have come into being at specific points in human history to serve specific purposes in society, and then they fade away once they've outlived their usefulness. That's how everything in society works. But fascists treat traditions like universal truths that have always existed and need to be preserved, militantly if necessary. Take gender roles, for example. Even the most basic, surface-level examination of human history would reveal that different societies have thought of gender in very different ways since the birth of human civilization. Where am I going with this? Well, let's take LGBTQ people, for example. They have existed for as long as humans have existed. That is a fact that should not be controversial in any way. But only recently has society developed to a point where they can safely be themselves in public. Now, to most well-adjusted people, this is a good thing that should be celebrated and cultivated. But that's not how fascists see things. To the fascist, the mere existence of LGBTQ people represents what they see as an encroachment on traditional gender roles, which, to be clear, is a made-up concept, but let's prove it with some statistics. So, as much as it might make my skin crawl, it'll be useful to define traditional gender roles for the purposes of this example. So, let's just define it as people who are both cisgender, meaning they identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, and heterosexual, which I hope is pretty self-explanatory, even for the more conservative people who might be watching. So I'm going to cite a Wikipedia article here because number 1, it's accessible to everybody, and number 2, the sources for this article seemed legit. And all it says is that in 2015 and 2016, polls indicated that people who identify as LGBTQ constituted about 4% of the US population. Now, there's some room to criticize this number because, for example, you can't really count people who haven't realized that they're LGBTQ, but even if you could, it probably wouldn't change the overall number that much. Now, let's suppose that those uncounted people actually do make up a large number of people, and counting them would make it so that LGBTQ people constituted about 10% of the US population. That would still mean that 90% of people conform to what we've defined as traditional gender roles, meaning that there shouldn't be any need to protect the construct of traditional gender roles. Like, if our statistics are even a little bit accurate, that should mean that the construct of traditional gender roles is self-perpetuating, right? Meaning that anyone who insists that we need to protect traditional gender roles, whatever that means, is either misinformed or they just want to use the state to oppress people they don't like. So now we have an idea of what the cult of tradition looks like in practice, but we still don't really know what type of thinking this is or how it works. So let's figure this out. At its heart, fascist thought is one of the many branches growing on the tree of conservative thought. So we now know what type of thinking this is, which means that we should be able to define it. But we immediately run into problems when we try to do that. So the reason why conservatism is hard to define is because it's a moving target. It's generally defined less by what it is and more by what it's opposed to. Additionally, things that are considered conservative now might at one point in history have been considered progressive. So why is this? The reason for this is that human society is in a state of constant progress. While it's true that some societies have experienced different forms of backsliding throughout history, society's overall trajectory is forward. The reason for this is that humans are constantly thinking and inventing new ideas. It's kind of what we do, and for one reason or another, some of those ideas become very popular and end up influencing the development of society. A good example of this process can be seen in the adoption of the idea of democracy. For most of human history, people have not lived in societies that we would really consider democratic by today's standards. Take monarchy, for example, in which a single person has all of the political power because they just do. Not very democratic by today's standards. But thousands of years ago in Greece, some old guys were like, that's a silly system. Who came up with that? What if, instead of a single person having all the power because reasons, the people decided what happens in society by voting on stuff? And whatever stuff gets the most votes is what society does. And boom, the idea of democracy is born. It took a little while to catch on, but depending on how you define democracy, it is the system of government that most people currently live under. Nowadays, a statement like democracy is good is kind of like saying the sky is blue or the grass is green. It's not really a conservative statement, depending on what kind of democracy you're talking about, and likewise, it wouldn't really be considered a progressive statement either, depending on what kind of democracy we're talking about. Nowadays, democracy is just kind of considered common sense, but less than 200 years ago, if you lived in a country like the Russian Empire, a statement like democracy is good wouldn't have just been considered a progressive statement, but a dangerously progressive one, and could have made you the target of state violence. So we've seen how an idea can go from being progressive to conservative, and we can all agree that social progress is, at the very least, a natural thing that can't be stopped. But we still don't know why someone might oppose progress. What would make someone oppose something that is a natural part of living in a society? When trying to tackle such questions, a lot of people invoke Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which is an interesting bit of philosophy that can definitely apply to what we're talking about. But it's so complex that a proper explanation really warrants its own video, which is why I've linked Abigail Thorne's video on the Hegelian dialectic in the description of this video. A lot of people have also pointed out that there are a lot of flaws in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Like, yeah, it can explain why people who already have a lot of power in society, that we might call upper class by today's standards, would have a conservative worldview, but it can't really explain the existence of conservative middle and lower class people who naturally make up the majority of conservatives because there are more middle and lower class people than there are upper class people. So instead of trying to force my explanation of conservatism into the framework of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, I'm going to use a 19th century version of a very old piece of philosophy. In his appropriately titled 1891 pamphlet on anarchism, Anarchy, Italian anarchist and sexiest man of the 1890s, Enrico Malatesta begins by asking the reader to imagine a man who has lived his entire life in chains. Malatesta then asks the reader to imagine the man's chains being removed. According to Malatesta, instead of feeling liberated and ready to take on the world, the man will wish to have his chains back. Malatesta's reason for arriving at this conclusion is that in order for the man to have kept his sanity after living in chains for such a long time, he's had to rationalize why the chains are there in the first place. It could be something like rationalizing the chains as a physical part of himself, or that maybe the chains are there for his protection. It doesn't really matter because it's just a coping mechanism, and as long as it succeeds in functioning as a coping mechanism, it doesn't necessarily need to even make sense. At the end of the day, the reasoning of the man who wants his chains back is rooted in the idea that sometimes the evil you know is preferable to the evil you don't. Now, Malatesta was using this allegory to convince people that a post-state society is more realistic than they think, because most people have little to no direct contact with the state on a day-to-day basis, and are therefore already largely self-governing. But I think that Malatesta's allegory of the man in chains can be applied to the conservative thought process. For example, if you're from a downwardly mobile family, and your prospects for life aren't exactly looking glamorous, rather than imagine a world where everybody is equal and taking steps to bring about that world by doing something like, I don't know, ending capitalism, you might resign yourself to your current conditions and tell yourself things like, the world might not be perfect, but this is just the best that we can do. And that's a very different type of conservatism than the stereotypical bigotry that we're used to seeing depicted in various types of media, and it can help explain why people who are members of groups that have historically been victims of oppression might sometimes support conservative causes. Now, I'm not trying to cast conservatism in a more sympathetic light. While I don't believe that all conservatives are inherently bad people, I do think that conservatism is a bad thing that needs to be stopped. But something so blatantly irrational as conservatism can't sustain itself without some sort of justification, and that's important to remember because fascism can't develop without an existing conservative movement in which it can take root. The idea that society is as developed as it can be at present doesn't have to be an exclusively conservative idea either. Since progressives believe that societal progress is constant and unending, that technically means that society has never been more developed than it is right now. But where the progressive differentiates themselves from the conservative is that to the progressive, tomorrow represents a chance to make the world a little bit better, and even better the day after that, whereas the conservative fears change. To the conservative, changes in society aren't seen as progress, but at best as changes that accomplish nothing, and at worst as steps towards anarchy, and not the fun kind of anarchy. Before we move on to Eco's next characteristic of fascism, I want to call attention to something specific about the cult of tradition. More specifically, how it changes as the fascist movement develops. It's my opinion that as the fascist movement develops, the cult of tradition transforms from a general desire to preserve traditions into what I call Roman fetishism. This can be something as subtle as appropriating Roman symbolism like the eagle. It could also be something like having one of your government institutions be inspired by a corresponding Roman institution, like how the US Senate is explicitly inspired by the Roman Senate. Arguably nobody took this further than Napoleon Bonaparte, who not only styled his hair like that of Julius Caesar, but also commissioned artwork and buildings styled in such a way as to invoke Roman culture. In fact, many of my favorite paintings of Napoleon depict him not as the colonial-era military leader he's known as, but instead as a Roman emperor. This is also a good time to bring up the fact that while the term fascism was first coined in the early 20th century, there have been many societies throughout history that one could argue fulfills the criteria of being fascist states, most notably Napoleon's France and the Roman Empire. Characteristic number 2, the rejection of modernism. So when you first hear the names of characteristics 1 and 2, they might sound similar, but hopefully you'll see how they're different after I explain. Remember when I said that fascism is riddled with internal contradictions? That statement goes double for Eco's second characteristic of fascism. If you think characteristic number 1 was complicated, you haven't seen anything yet. Eco is very specific that the fascists' rejection of modernism is something that they do hypocritically, as they tend to praise and take credit for technological advancement. According to Eco, fascists basically use the term modern to describe anything that they don't like. And once we describe characteristic number 2 in that way, we can all probably think of some examples of fascists doing this. Eco specifically identifies the tradition of rational thought and secularism that emerged in Europe during the European Enlightenment as the thing that fascists have an especially high disdain for, and this makes a lot of sense in the context of the fascism of the early 20th century that Eco was writing about, because those fascist movements built massive propaganda machines meant to portray the fascist movement in an almost biblical, larger-than-life image. But because fascism is an inherently irrational ideology, the perceived rationality of the European Enlightenment posed a direct threat to fascism because of fascism's inability to defend itself against rational thought. That being said, while there are still hyper-religious fascists who use biblical language to describe their movement, it's my opinion that contemporary fascism is decidedly more secular than its early 20th century predecessors. Not necessarily fully secular, just more secular. Fascists have also tried to discredit Eco on the basis of his use of the word modernism in the rejection of modernism, insisting that futurism is actually a big part of fascism. But this is a deflection that deliberately misses the point of what Eco is saying. If you actually read the essay that the 14 characteristics of fascism are from, you'll see that Eco is aware that Italian fascism did involve a very superficial invocation of futurism, but that the ideology of futurism isn't a part of the ideology of fascism. And to restate my previous point, fascists use the term modern to describe anything that they don't like. What is modern to the fascist is completely unrelated to what words like modern and modernism mean in academic circles, where the definitions of words are very specific. In fact, modern is just one of many terms that fascists have appropriated to describe things that they don't like. You might be having trouble thinking of a contemporary example of fascists calling something modernist in a derogatory manner, but if you just replace the word modernist with degenerate, feminist, Marxist, liberal, communist, and of course, postmodern neo-Marxist, it suddenly becomes very easy to think of examples of fascists doing what Eco is talking about here. It's also worth noting that none of the words I substituted for modernist mean what they actually mean when they're used in this manner. It would be more accurate to say that what fascists are actually doing when they reject modernism is they're scapegoating imaginary enemies. You could think of any problem facing contemporary society, some of which are genuinely the results of the actions of a relatively small group of individuals, but most of which are more systemic in their causes. And regardless of what the actual cause of a problem is, fascists will always blame it on an imaginary enemy that they blame for all of society's problems. It's at this point that you're probably starting to realize how the fascists' hatred for a very specific group of people fits into Eco's second characteristic of fascism, but we're not going to talk about that right now because we're going to come back to it later. Characteristic number 3, the obsession with a plot. In her series on liberalism, YouTuber Abigail Thorne says, the goal of all political ideologies is to determine what actions are acceptable and who are the acceptable targets of violence. Now, by no means does this mean that all ideologies are equally violent or that they're all equally good choices. That's not what Abigail is saying, and that's not what I'm saying either. But once we understand the job of an ideology, we can analyze some of its component parts a little bit more accurately. Such is the case with the third characteristic of fascism we're going to talk about, the obsession with a plot. As we'll see in a minute, there is no uniform version of what I'm going to call the fascist plot. In fact, fascists can believe in and incorporate multiple, sometimes contradictory plots simultaneously. While there isn't a lot of uniformity, there are several tropes that keep popping up in the plots that fascists build around their movements. For example, the fascist plot usually states that society is in decay, a statement which is actually true sometimes for reasons we'll talk about later. The plot also usually asserts that society is controlled by a small group of secretive elites who want to take over the world because, well, the fascists never really say why, but they insist that this part of the plot is true. The plot also usually asserts that the only way to save society is to revive the values and laws from a mythologized past, and the fascists are also usually very vague about exactly when this past was. And finally, the plot usually asserts that the state has been infiltrated and compromised by the kinds of imaginary enemies that fascists love to blame on everything, and can therefore no longer be expected to function properly. And that's all very vague, so let's look at some contemporary examples of what we might call fascist plots in the US. The first fascist conspiracy theory that comes to mind is the Great Replacement Conspiracy, which states that people of color are engaged in a genocide against white people, and that the way that they seek to exterminate white people is by forming relationships with them and having mixed-race children. I think it goes without saying that in order to believe this one, you already need to be an extremely racist person. If you live in the US, you might have heard of a different fascist conspiracy called QAnon, which states that the world is controlled by a small group of powerful Jews who kidnap and ritualistically consume the blood of children in order to live longer, and that Donald Trump has been chosen by God to expose the crimes of these individuals and bring them to justice. I wasn't kidding when I said fascism is inherently irrational. So how does the fascist plot relate to what I said about ideologies determining what actions are acceptable and who are the acceptable targets of violence? Well, if the scapegoating described by characteristic number 2 helps identify who are the enemies of the fascist movement, then the fascist plot described by characteristic number 3 helps to contextualize why they are the enemies of the fascist movement. It's also important to remember that because the fascist plot is completely fictional, it can be added to or completely rewritten whenever it's necessary to do so. For example, in the months prior to the 2020 presidential election, it was assumed by fascists that a Donald Trump victory was inevitable. But when Trump lost the election, the fascist plot had to be rewritten to say that Trump actually did win, but that massive voter fraud led to an illegitimate Joe Biden victory. I reiterate, if any of this seems nonsensical, that's because it is. Fascists are not in touch with reality. Characteristic number 4 appeals to a frustrated middle class. So we've talked about some of the characteristics of fascism that can help explain how fascists think, and there are more that we'll talk about later, but in spite of how irrational and disgusting fascism is, there are reasons why fascism is so hard to get rid of, and the way that fascism makes appeals to a frustrated middle class can help us understand why that is. Remember when I said that the part of the fascist plot that asserts that society is declining can be true sometimes? Well, let's look at an example of that. In the late 1970s, the US economy was stagnating. So in the early 1980s, the US elected some actor from California named Ronald Reagan to be president. Mr. Reagan promised that he was going to fix the economy by cutting taxes and deregulating everything, allowing businesses to keep more of the money that they were making. And once the businesses had that money, they were supposed to give raises to all of their employees, from the executives to the custodians. And that money was supposed to trickle down, and the middle class would get bigger, and nobody would be hungry, and we would outpace the commies, and nobody could say that capitalism doesn't work. I hate to break it to you if you're watching this in the year 1980, but it didn't work. In fact, Mr. Reagan's economic policies did the exact opposite of what he promised, because once businesses had all that money, instead of giving raises to all their employees, they just bought out their competition. They also spent a lot of money on stock buybacks, which were illegal prior to the Reagan administration because it's an obvious form of stock manipulation. And last but not least, they fired a lot of workers because the Reagan administration decided not to enforce anti-union busting laws. And aside from a few small bills during the Clinton and Obama administrations that didn't really do much, nobody ever really reversed Reagan's economic policies. In fact, the presidents that came after Reagan, including Clinton and Obama, mostly continued and/or expanded Reagan's economic policies, and the middle class has been getting smaller ever since. The fact that the middle class is actually shrinking means that there's a very real anxiety in society that can be exploited by fascists. For example, if you're someone who makes a decent amount of money but are naturally afraid of losing everything you have because of things like inflation and the rising costs of living, and someone comes along who claims to know how to prevent or reverse the forces that are making your way of life increasingly insecure, you're probably going to support them even if you disagree with most of their ideas. Because if you don't understand why the middle class is actually shrinking, and someone comes along who just speaks confidently and claims to know what they're talking about, you're probably going to listen to them even if they're wrong, because it helps you make sense of a complicated world. Following World War II, people rightfully wanted to know why so many people living in Axis countries were willing to tolerate living in fascist states, and the way that fascist movements make appeals to a frustrated middle class and exploit existing social tensions can partially explain why. Sometimes the reasons for why people tolerate fascism have nothing to do with anything that the fascists do themselves. For an example of this, I recommend watching Abigail Thorne's series on liberalism, in which she briefly explains why liberalism has a tendency to slide to the right. Characteristic number 5, the fear of difference. So you might think that this characteristic of fascism was already implicit in how we defined characteristic number 2. So what makes this characteristic different? Well, in short, I think that the fear of difference supplies the underlying thought that drives the rejection of modernism. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still a lot to unpack here. In his analysis, Eco identifies the low-hanging fruit, explaining how this characteristic is related to things like racism and anti-Semitism. But this explanation feels a little incomplete to me. For example, there's a lot riding on how we define different, and more specifically, how the fascist defines what counts as different. And Eco doesn't really bother with that, meaning that there's this whole layer of meaning to characteristic number 5 that needs to be addressed, and I think I know how to figure this out. So where does the word fascism come from? Well, it's derived from the Latin word fasces, which refers to a bundle of sticks which sometimes has a blade emerging from one end. In the Roman Empire, notice how we're talking about the Roman Empire again, the fasces was meant to symbolize strength through unity, the idea being that a single stick is fragile and breaks easily, but becomes unbreakable when bound together with other sticks. The fasces has actually been adopted by a number of political movements throughout history. For example, the US Capitol building has statues of the fasces in the room where Congress meets. But saying that you believe in strength through unity is kind of like saying that you think democracy is good, or that the sky is blue. Everybody believes that. Even ideologies that place a lot of importance on individualism acknowledge that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is by having lots of people work together on it. That's literally the idea behind raising a standing army. So right away we've run into a problem where it appears that fascists are disguising their beliefs behind an otherwise uncontroversial idea. Luckily for us, the fascists' actions usually speak louder than their words, so maybe if we look at some examples of what fascists do, we'll be able to unlock the secrets of Eco's 5th characteristic of fascism. Let's start by looking at some pictures. So the people in the picture on screen right now are not fascists as far as I know. This picture is of course a picture from a pride parade, and if we look at the picture, I think that there are several assumptions that we can make about the people in the picture with a reasonable degree of accuracy. So for starters, we can probably assume that some of the people in this picture might be gay. We can also assume that some of them might be bisexual. Some of them are probably cisgender, but there are also probably some trans and non-binary people in this picture. Some of them might even be heterosexual and are just there to support a cause that they believe in. The main idea I'm getting at here is that no matter how hard we try, there's no way for us to group everyone in this picture into some kind of monolith. There's simply too much diversity of identity, opinion, and experience contained in this picture. Now look at this picture. Even though not everyone in it is carrying the same flag or is a member of the same group, we know that if we really felt like it, we could probably group their beliefs into 10 or 20 points that a scholar has come up with to describe fascism. So what was the point of showing these two pictures, and what does it have to do with our original question about strength through unity and what it means to fascists? Well, the picture of the Pride Parade shows an almost infinitely diverse group of people who are all united by the common cause of LGBTQ+ rights, while the picture of the January 6th insurrection shows a much more homogeneous group of people who all have similar identities and worldviews. In other words, the first picture shows unity, while the second picture shows uniformity. And now we have a much more specific idea of what unity means to the fascist. To the fascist, unity is synonymous with words like uniformity and homogeneity, and that actually makes a lot of sense when we think about it. For example, for the Nazis, it wasn't enough for everybody to just be white. They were very explicit about the fact that they wanted to create a world where everybody had blonde hair and blue eyes. So we've answered the what of characteristic number 5, but we still haven't answered the why yet. I believe that the answer to why fascists are afraid of diversity is related to fascism's inability to defend itself against rational thought. Because fascism can't defend itself against rational thought, fascists are conditioned to reject viewpoints that contradict their own, and seek to strengthen their movement by making it as homogeneous as possible. Characteristic number 6. Disagreement is treason. Finally, this one is pretty straightforward, and the analysis that we've done for previous characteristics can explain what's going on with this characteristic. Let's go back to what the goal of an ideology is. The goal of all ideologies is to determine what actions are acceptable and who are the acceptable targets of violence, and we can see how the idea that disagreement is treason fits into that. We know that fascists seek to make their movement stronger by making it more uniform, and uniformity of opinions is a big part of that. Furthermore, the fascists' obsession with a plot supplies the fascists with several groups of imaginary enemies whose very existence poses a threat to the fascist movement. Therefore, when someone disagrees with a fascist, that person is automatically marking themselves as an enemy of the fascist movement, and potentially as a member of a group that fascists already don't like. And characteristic number 2 partially supplies fascists with instructions for how they are then supposed to react when an enemy reveals themselves. I say partially supplies the fascists with instructions for a very specific reason that I'll be expanding on later. This brings me to what I'm going to call mini-conclusion number 1. Characteristics 2, 3, 5, and 6 combine to form a system that allows fascists to identify who they believe are the acceptable targets of violence. Characteristic number 5 tells fascists that they're supposed to fear or reject difference. Characteristic number 3, the fascist plot, helps supply a reason for why fascists are supposed to fear or reject difference. Characteristic number 6 gives fascists a way to identify individuals that they consider to be enemies of their movement, and characteristic number 2 gives fascists partial instructions for how to deal with their enemies. Characteristic number 7. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy because life is permanent warfare. Even though Eco says that these characteristics are roughly equal in importance, I feel like this is one of a handful that rises above the others. And now that we've largely determined the psychology of fascists, our analysis of the remaining characteristics shouldn't take too long. So why is pacifism trafficking with the enemy, and why is life permanent warfare to the fascist? The answers to these questions can usually be found in whatever plot the fascist movement happens to believe in. As mentioned before, the fascist plot usually asserts that society is under some kind of attack by foreign and domestic enemies, and that the reason why nobody can tell is because the state and its institutions have been compromised and there are enemy agents everywhere. The fascist plot also usually asserts that these enemies are determined to destroy our way of life for some reason. It's at this point that I feel the need to remind everybody that absolutely none of this is true. We know who the real enemies to society are. It's people like the Sacklers and Charlie Koch and Rupert Murdoch. But fascists will always insist that the real enemies are the ones that they've made up, and that because these imaginary enemies are supposedly everywhere waging an endless war against our way of life, pacifism is unacceptable, because current conditions supposedly demand that fascists take matters into their own hands. Characteristic number 8. Everybody is educated to become a hero. This characteristic builds nicely on the ones that we've discussed so far. Because fascists believe that the state has been compromised and there are enemies everywhere who are determined to destroy society as we know it, as we've discussed many times already, fascists feel that it's necessary to take matters into their own hands when fighting these enemies. The thing is, nobody becomes a soldier overnight. This brings us to something of a trademark of well-developed fascist movements, the paramilitary group. Now, by no means are paramilitary groups unique to fascist movements, but due to characteristics unique to fascist ideology, fascist movements are much more prone to forming paramilitary groups rather than something like a mutual aid organization or a trade union. For example, the end goal of all fascist movements is violence, and I'll expand more on that idea later, and paramilitary groups are obviously very well suited to committing acts of violence, but there are several other traits that make paramilitary groups preferable platforms for fascists. For example, Paramilitary groups give fascists a platform that they can use for training, and sometimes the training offered by paramilitary groups isn't explicitly combat-oriented or limited to members of the paramilitary group. Paramilitary groups might offer outdoor safety courses and other similar courses that they use as a source of revenue. Also, if you have a group like a paramilitary group, and everyone who is a member has to pay a membership fee, that money can be used to produce posters and pamphlets that fascists can use to spread propaganda and recruit new members. So remember when I said that the end goal of all fascist movements is violence? Well, understanding the reason for why this is necessary for understanding an important aspect of the characteristic we're discussing. I've said multiple times now that the goal of all political ideologies is to determine what actions are acceptable and who are the acceptable targets of violence. We've seen how fascism determines who the acceptable targets of violence are, but how does it determine what actions are acceptable? Well, it kind of doesn't. This is mainly because openly advocating for violence is usually illegal, especially if the targets of that violence are being targeted for their race or ethnicity, for example. Also, fascist movements will generally try and maintain some kind of plausible deniability until their movement is big enough that they don't have to anymore. So fascists might avoid calling for violence early on, but they'll do it more frequently as their movement gets bigger. For these reasons, fascists will usually avoid openly advocating for violence, but violence is still very much implied by the rhetoric that fascists use. And this is incredibly important because when you tell the members of your movement that society is under attack by a group of imaginary enemies who will not stop unless they are defeated, and then you don't specify what actions you want the members of your movement to employ against this enemy, the members of your movement are going to conclude that all actions are acceptable, and that if the enemy will not stop, then they must be stopped by any means necessary. Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios has talked at length about how fascist movements spend a lot of time telling their followers who the enemy is, why they need to be stopped, and just generally trying to stoke and direct the anger of their followers. But then they don't give their followers anything to do. Fascist movements tell their followers, these are the bad guys, they need to be stopped, and then they don't tell their followers how to stop the bad guys. According to everyone who has studied these sorts of movements, this is a recipe for lone wolf violence. And I'm not making this up. A lot of the mass shootings that have happened in the US in recent years fit this description. The way that fascism determines what actions are acceptable is by not determining what actions are acceptable. Because if you don't specify what actions are acceptable, then all actions are acceptable. So how does this relate to everybody being educated to become a hero? Well, fascists will glorify any action taken against those they consider to be their enemies, even if the perpetrator of those actions dies in the process. Echo stresses that the ultimate result of everybody being educated to become a hero is that the fascist movement will develop a cult of martyrdom. To the fascist, there is no action more heroic than to die defending your homeland from foreign and domestic enemies. In short, fascists glorify individual violence, and they use groups like paramilitaries to facilitate this sort of violence by teaching people things like how to use a weapon. But paramilitaries themselves are usually not the main vehicle for this violence until after fascists have seized power. Another good example of this characteristic in action can be observed in the Doomsday Prepper movement, which the YouTube channel We're in Hell has a video about. Characteristic number 9, selective populism. I'm putting this characteristic here because I'm not really sure where else to put it, but I still feel like it's a pretty important characteristic. Now, in order to understand what selective populism is, we first need to understand what populism is. So, what is populism? There's a lot of debate over whether or not populism counts as an ideology. I personally don't think so because populism is something that people can do regardless of their political beliefs, but generally speaking, populism is a framing device that frames issues in society as being between the people and the elites. Take the housing crisis in the United States, for example. A populist would say that the lack of affordable housing in the United States is a result of elites buying multiple houses at or above their asking price, leading to inflated prices that are simply unaffordable for most people. That's a very populist way of framing an issue like the housing crisis in the United States. What separates the selective populism of fascism from something like left-wing populism is that the elites that fascists blame for society's problems are usually chosen for some very specific reasons, and elites that don't fit into this mold that fascists have created are simply ignored. For example, fascists love naming people like George Soros, Bob Chapek, and Michael Bloomberg as people who are actively contributing to the degradation of society, but they'll do this while actively ignoring how people like Charlie Koch, Rupert Murdoch, and the Sackler family are guilty of many of the same things. A left-wing populist might tell you that while some billionaires are quantifiably worse than others, they all ultimately share some of the responsibility for making the world a worse place, and that some of them, like Rupert Murdoch, actually do exercise a dangerous amount of control over the media. But a fascist populist will ignore billionaires that support fascist causes in order to hyper-focus on those, usually Jewish billionaires, who do not. All you need to do to spot selective populism is listen to what fascists say, as well as what they don't say. While they might use populist rhetoric frequently, they can always be counted on to make exceptions, and as mentioned before, fascists will usually hyper-focus on Jewish billionaires while ignoring non-Jewish billionaires who are usually more guilty of the things that fascists accuse billionaires of doing. Characteristic number 10. The enemy is simultaneously too strong and too weak. This is an easy one. Fascists will often depict groups of people they don't like as being simultaneously too strong and too weak. For example, fascists will often oscillate between calling groups of people they don't like lazy freeloaders on the one hand and dangerous criminals on the other hand. The problem with this is that these two depictions are in direct contradiction with each other. Regardless of what you think of criminals, being a career criminal is not an easy job. It's not the kind of thing that a lazy freeloader is capable of. Regardless of what you might think of some of Eco's other characteristics of fascism, the tendency to depict enemies as being simultaneously too strong and too weak is a trademark of fascist rhetoric. It's also something that Donald Trump and his followers do constantly. Here are some examples.
He said Muslims are a problem. Okay? That's what he said. Okay, are they a problem? You tell me. And I say, I don't see the people, and I use it often, that knocked down the World Trade Center going back to Sweden. By the way, most Muslims, I know many, are great people, just so you put it on the record.
So let's say, do you think Muslims are a problem?
I mean, you have ISIS, you have the migration, you have all of this stuff, you have, you know, a lot of people think you're going to end up with World War III. I have great friendships with many people who are Muslim, living in this building, okay, living here. But I have great friendships. They're phenomenal people, because there's a radical Islamic group of people that is brutal.
Characteristic number 11. Machismo. We follow one of Eco's simplest characteristics of fascism with the one that is debatably his most misunderstood. The simplest way of explaining machismo would be to say that it's simply about projecting strength, but as we've seen with previous characteristics, there's a lot riding on how we define certain words, and in this case the word that we really need to define in order to understand this characteristic is strength. To a well-adjusted person, strength can manifest itself many different ways in many different people. Yes, lifting 500 pounds is a feat of strength. I think everyone can agree with that. But I would also argue that giving birth is a feat of strength. It's often said that giving birth is one of the most painful things that a person can experience, and it's something that roughly half of all people will experience at least once in their lives. And that can be a very different idea of strength than we're used to thinking about. To the fascist, and American society more generally, strength is inherently male-coded. In Hollywood movies, for example, whether or not a female character is considered strong usually depends heavily on their ability to take part in the same activities as male characters. Now, I want to be clear that the sorts of activities that male characters take part in usually reinforce a very negative version of masculinity, but these activities are usually coded male by having male characters take part in them at a much higher rate than female characters. In fact, fascists will often go a step further than Hollywood by not only assuming that certain activities are male-coded, but that men have a monopoly on participation in such activities. Part of the problem with seeing strength as male-coded is that it limits the ways of expressing strength to the limits of what I'm going to call the archetypal male imagination. To the fascist, the only way to express one's strength is by acting on something. For example, if you lift a weight, you lift it by acting on it and moving it. If the fascist wants to show that he's stronger than his fellow man, sooner or later he's going to do that by using force on his fellow man. Therefore, the idea of strength is intrinsically entangled with the idea of conquest in the mind of the fascist, because the only way that the fascist knows how to express strength is by acting on a foreign object. Because fascists subscribe to a very narrow idea of strength that can itself only be expressed by a very narrow segment of the population, anyone who does not conform with the fascists' idea of what a strong person should be is automatically coded as weak in the mind of the fascist, and understanding how fascists perceive strength and weakness is important to understanding Eco's next characteristic of fascism. Characteristic number 12. Contempt for the weak. Now that we've learned how the fascist defines and measures strength, we can deduce how they do the same for the concept of weakness. Generally speaking, fascists use the concept of strength as a mechanism to rank different groups and individuals in society. Now, because the fascist conception of strength is not only deeply flawed, but incredibly subjective, fascists unsurprisingly end up at the top of their own hierarchy because they believe themselves to be the strongest. Fascists then organize every other group in society based on how strong they are considered to be by the fascists in relation to the fascists, with those ranking lower on the hierarchy often being considered subhuman. It's also worth mentioning briefly while we're on the topic of hierarchies that fascists seem to have an affinity for describing those that rank lower on their hierarchy as degenerates. I have no idea why they always seem to settle on that word, but I try and pick the brains of people that I hear using that word, and a lot of the time they do end up having some fascist tendencies. So, moral of the story, it's a popular fascist dog whistle, and it's usually a good idea to be wary of people that you hear using it. Characteristic number 13. Newspeak. Yes, the name of this characteristic is taken from George Orwell's 1949 book, 1984. If there's already a name for the thing that you're trying to describe, why bother inventing a new name for it? As we've seen throughout our analysis of Eco's description of fascism, fascism contains numerous mechanisms that are meant to help determine friend from foe, and this characteristic is no different. Take the phrase, "Let's go Brandon," for example. This phrase was adopted by American fascist movements in 2021 after a crowd of NASCAR fans chanting, "Let's go Brandon," Brandon in this case being one of the racers, were misunderstood and thought to be saying, "Fuck Joe Biden." Since this initial event, American fascists have used the phrase, "Let's go Brandon," in the place of "Fuck Joe Biden." So what, if any, advantages are there to using one of these phrases over the other if you're a fascist? Well, I'm recording this at some point after January of 2022, and at the moment, President Joe Biden's approval rating is not very high with voters of either major political party in the US. So, if I were to strip all of the left-wing symbolism off of my clothes and I walked into a bar full of fascists and I just yelled, "Fuck Joe Biden," that wouldn't necessarily tell the fascists in the bar whether or not I'm a friend of theirs. But if I were to walk into the same bar and yell, "Let's go Brandon," the fascists in the bar would immediately go, "Ah, let's go Brandon." They would immediately think that I'm one of them. There are literally so many fascist newspeak terms that there are entire websites dedicated to listing all of them. I'll try to link some in the description. Characteristic number 14. The cult of action for action's sake. I'm putting this characteristic last because I wasn't sure where else to put it in my analysis, but don't think that means this characteristic is any less important than the others we've talked about. This characteristic is observable in many past and present fascist movements, including those in the United States. Eco is very clear that this characteristic is deeply tied to a deep-seated anti-intellectualism that exists within fascist ideology, and that the goal of the cult of action is to keep the fascists from thinking critically. But I think that this characteristic is a little bit more complicated in practice. To prove this, we're going to separate fascists into two subgroups: fascist leaders and fascist followers. For the fascist follower, I find Echo's analysis to be sufficient. Participation in the cult of action is meant solely to prevent the fascist follower from thinking critically, but things are a little bit different for the fascist leader. For the fascist leader, the cult of action is not meant to prevent the fascist leader himself from thinking critically, but to prevent the fascist follower from thinking critically, just as when the fascist follower takes part in the cult of action. The reason for this is that fascist leaders are often flanked by cameras and microphones to record their every action, and in doing so produce propaganda to be consumed by the fascist follower, who sees that their leader is doing something. Whether or not the actions of the fascist leader are productive is completely irrelevant here. It's at this point that some of the more savvy viewers are probably thinking of the events of June 1st, 2020, in which Washington, D.C. police fired non-lethal munitions at a crowd of people peacefully protesting in Lafayette Square in order to move them out of the area so that then President Trump could have a bizarre and meaningless photo op in front of St. John's Church. Fun fact, there is an entire Wikipedia article for that one event, but instead of talking about that, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit closer to home for me. Just 4 days after the Lafayette Square incident, President Orangeman traveled to my home state to tour the Puritan Medical Products factory where medical supplies, most notably cotton swabs, were being manufactured. Orangeman's visit was meant to draw attention to how the United States had developed the means to manufacture its own medical supplies, a contrast from earlier in the coronavirus pandemic when the United States' dependency on imported supplies led to shortages which led to thousands of unnecessary deaths. During his tour, President Orangeman insisted on walking around the factory floor to get photos of himself around the supplies and the machinery, but refused to follow proper sanitation protocol for anyone entering the factory floor. While he was on the factory floor, President Orangeman reached down onto a conveyor belt and picked up a cotton swab so that this picture could be taken. However, by simply entering the factory floor without following sanitation measures, President Orangeman had contaminated everything that was in the room, and as a result, all of the medical supplies that were in that room had to be thrown away. We're talking about tens of thousands of cotton swabs among other supplies that could have been used to test people and could have saved lives. Just thrown away. All because Orangeman couldn't be bothered to follow sanitation protocol in the middle of a fucking pandemic that he was failing to handle. Trump's actions during the Lafayette Square incident may have been unproductive, but his actions during the Puritan manufacturing incident were counterproductive and probably led to unnecessary deaths. But it didn't matter in either case because he was able to get photos where it looked like he was doing something, and his followers ate it up. This is what the cult of action looks like in practice. Now that we're finished looking at Umberto Eco's analysis of fascism, let's look at some criticisms that have been made of his work. Hey guys, this video was too big for my computer, so I had to split it into 2 parts. Any minute now, the link to part 2 should be appearing on screen, and I'll also put it in the description to this video. See you in part 2.